it seems like people often adhere to these ideologies with what I think can only be described as like a religious fervor. And, Durkheim and others wrote also a lot about, the purpose and function of religion in society. It's a topic I'm very interested in. So do you have any thoughts on like what the relationship between the decline of what we can just call traditional organized religions in America has been in relationship to the emergence and ascension of some of these new political and social ideologies, or these new sort of institutional structures that are ostensibly trying to remedy problems that they are in fact perpetuating?
Yeah. So Durkheim wrote pardon this like mini lecture, but for I assume most of the listeners have not read Durkheim, but in the elementary forms of religious life, Durkheim looked at the field notes of a bunch of anthropologists who were looking primarily at Aboriginal tribes in Australia, and he sort of in these were quote unquote primitive societies. I'm just going to use that term, even though some people find it offensive. But by primitive, and he used that term, but really, I think he even used the term savage, but really what he meant was elementary, pre-division of labor. And so these were society communities in which people lived isolated lives. Like if you're a subsistence farmer, you live in a community where you have neighbors who you don't see every day because they live too far away, but you also don't see them every day because you don't need to see them every day because you're a subsistence farmer. Everything that you have is at home, right? With your family, you literally have no material need to see other people ever. So his question was, how do you cohere a community together of people who live materially isolated lives, or how do they cohere their communities together? So he looked at these tribes where that was essentially the material conditions of their existence. And he found that periodically they would come together and have these religious ceremonies in which that were really intense. They involved like a lot of dancing and drumming and spiritual elevation, chanting, and like going without
shamanism, basically.
Yes, yeah. Going out with water and food, without water and food for days on end, in intense heat, and so they would achieve this sort of transcendental experience with these rituals. And what Durkheim's theory was that, so he called this collective effervescence. It's like the feeling when you're in the midst of, like, we've experienced it on a sort of lower level, like a basketball game, or like a political march where you're like chanting and you just feel like you're one of the crowd and you're kind of uplifted, and it creates the sense of cohesion of everybody there. So basically you transcend your life as an individual and you enter into the sublime state when you belong to the life of the collective.
Yeah. And, immediately I think of a couple things here. Like, when you see, there are many kinds of examples of this, but, like when some sports team wins the championship and then everyone's out rioting in the streets, you're like, why the hell are they rioting effectively? But it's because they go into this psychological state where they don't feel like an atomized individual. They feel like part of a coherent community. And it is a very good feeling. People like having that feeling. And, I didn't actually expect the conversation to go here, but the last episode with a man named Michael Winkelmann, an anthropologist, was all about shamanism in ancient hunter-gatherer groups and, what it was and what it did. And the thing that I did not realize is how frequently these sort of shamanic group ritual practices involving, drumming and reaching these ecstatic states actually were. It wasn't once per year. It wasn't once per lunar cycle. It was every, 2 to 4 weeks in most traditional cultures, because presumably that frequency is required to maintain the kind of group coherence necessary to just have a stable society.
Durkheim actually writes about that. He says explicitly that, when these people go back to their own private existences as individuals, the collective effervescence that they experience has sort of like a, there's a residue of it that remains, but then it starts to deplete. And so like after, when it gets to the point where it's pretty much depleted, then there's a need for another cycle to bring the tribe together again. And in Durkheim's view, this is all in these pre-division of labor societies. He called this mechanical solidarity, because it was like a mechanical thing where you just like come together, have it, and then part, and then come together and apart. And it's very mechanical as opposed to organic. Organic solidarity is the solidarity that comes from from a more complex society. When I wake up in the morning and have a cup of coffee, right, it's like I'm waking up in a house that was built by somebody else, in a bed that was built by somebody else, with sheets that were manufactured by somebody else. I go and get take out coffee beans that were grown by somebody else and distributed by somebody else. It's like 1 million people have participated in the process of getting me from the bed to my hot cup of coffee every morning, right? Because we're all integrated in that way. We are the farthest thing from self-sufficient. And so Durkheim believed, and I think was too confident in this opinion, that that organic solidarity, those material bonds of between us, start to sort of crowd out the need for this mechanical solidarity. And so that's why you have religion start to play more and more of a background role in modern societies. But the thing that we found is that you still need it's not enough. You still need the mechanical solidarity.
Yeah, that's why collective effervescence must be felt. Otherwise, things are just going to disintegrate into chaos.
Right, and
so something will evolve.
Right, and so we had for a long time, the United States bucked the trend of Western Europe and continued to be a very religious society, even though, even in the United States, it tailed off over generations. But, we, as the most advanced capitalist society, we still had a lot of religion. And now we have been falling into the pattern of Western Europe with people being less and less attentive to church. And so now we found, other ways, and I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg in this case, but we found other ways to achieve this sort of in-group feeling. And a lot of that is, just like collective effervescence can be a very beautiful thing, and it can also be a very dangerous thing. And in the same way, the sort of in-group, out-group stuff that we're now finding, I think, online, it's like there's this digital version of collective effervescence, which is like, the group pylons on Twitter, the sort of the mob actions that create the sense of like, clearly the purpose is to, we don't quite achieve a transcendental state, but there is this feeling of belonging, this like kind of very like lizard brain feeling of belonging that comes from interactions.
Yeah. I mean, and I think we all know intuitively that everyone wants to belong. When you start to think about it more deeply, right, we start to think about things like, we're social primates. We exist in social status hierarchies. People want to maintain their status or increase it. No one ever wants to decrease it. Mm-hmm. And that ties into some of the things that we're talking about, I think. And if I try and stitch a couple of things together here, when we were talking about the sort of nonprofit industrial complex and the sense of belonging it presumably gives the people that go into that line of work and subscribe to some of those ideologies, where do those people come from, in the sense of, I think this probably ties into the fact that, right, college became so important for people to go to, and more people had to go to college, and we produced so many of those people. And I think a lot of people would even say that we overproduced to them, meaning more people started getting college degrees they thought were a ticket to, some higher level of social status, whatever exactly that meant for any individual. But there just weren't enough slots for a lot of people in other domains of life. And so that sort of overproduction of people that feel like they have this ticket to a higher level of social status creates a kind of anxiety that then funnels them elsewhere. Where does your mind go when we start thinking about things like that?
Yeah, the overproduction of elites has always been a very dangerous thing. So there I'm not an expert on this, but I have read accounts of the Crusades having been caused by the overproduction of elites, because as populations got denser in Europe, they had these primogeniture laws where you had to, hand all your land down to the first son, and what that means is that the land plots started getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then the second son and the third son were left with nothing, and so you had all these elite warrior aristocrat nobles with nothing to do, and it became a crisis in Europe. And then they were like, okay, we've got to do something with these people, send them to Jerusalem, to reclaim the Holy Land. And then they went out and created this abomination of the Crusades. So it's like, this has always been a dangerous force in every society, and I think I do believe that we have that now, because we are producing more and more would-be white-collar workers. But the economy has become more and more bifurcated. There are only so many tech jobs to go around. And so we have, I think the experience of the millennial generation was one in which you had a bunch of kids who played by all the rules, went to good colleges. And I'm not talking about the majority of millennials. The majority of millennials, like every other generation, don't have college degrees. But among the elite tier of the millennials, you had all these these kids going to college, and they, naturally expected to have a upper middle class lifestyle after graduating from a prestigious university. And, then they graduated in the time of the Great Recession, and there were no jobs for them. The sort of the girls, the HBO girls kind of story. And so first of all, I wrote about this once before, because Pierre Bourdieu wrote about this very similar moment when this happened in Paris in the 19th century that created the Bohemians. I won't go into that too much, but there's a parallel thing that happened now where there is this sort of like, because colleges have become so hyper politicized, these kids graduated from a school with this sort of training, with this sort of they had inculcated all these values of the political activist, and then they came out into a world in which their material expectations were not met. And so they started going into the industries that they could and competing with each other over these jobs in like tech and in media. But they brought with them this sort of the habitus of the professional, of the political activist. And so there became this contest within these industries that over like who's more politically pure. And you had this, you had like the New York Times, the pivot that the New York Times had towards wokeness was driven. There was a really interesting New York Magazine article about how it was driven by the tech workers, like the people who are designing the New York Times app, not the reporters. And it's because they'd all come from the New York Times had in its sort of mission to surpass which it achieved, of surpassing all the other media outlets in terms of its digital presence, recruited all these people from Facebook and Twitter and all these Silicon Valley firms, recruited all these coders, but they couldn't compete salary-wise with those companies. So they basically said, look, well, you're wasting your life. Like, that you're not doing any good for the world by working for Facebook. If you come with us, like, we'll pay you a decent salary, but you'll get the psychic benefit of being able to make a difference in the world. And they bought that hook, line, and sinker. And then they came to the New York Times and they realized that journalism isn't like that they were like, you actually had to report stories as they happened and not the way you wish they'd happened, that people with opinions that you don't agree with get space on the op-ed page too. And they threw a fit and a temper tantrum. And this was kind of the what generated the anger around that Tom Cotton op-ed that ousted James Bennett as the opinion editor. A lot of that came from like the tech folks at the New York Times. So it's clearly something that's beyond just the media. It's a generational transformation that's occurred.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to unpack a little bit more is this concept of elites and what makes someone elite. And there's a lot of confusion there, naturally, because, this is a relative term. It's also a term that people use in different ways. When some people refer to the elites, they're talking about one group of people. When someone else refers to the elites, they're talking about other people. And I'm just wondering what your take is on what makes someone an elite. And I think maybe a good hook there is this distinction that I think you made in at least one of your articles between like financial, cultural, and moral capital. Right. And there's these different forms of like social capital we can have. Traditionally, we think of capital as being the financial version, and that's maybe the most intuitive to think about, but it's not the only version of social capital that someone can wield. And so can you contrast those things and maybe use that as a way to think about what actually makes someone elite or powerful in a society?
Yeah, so this is all Pierre Bourdieu, not my original thinking. So I'm just kind of regurgitating his theory. But he looked at it as there's economic capital, which was sort of the if you come from a Marxist tradition, you tend to see that as the sole distinguishing feature between classes, is your control of economic capital. Bourdieu perceived, because he came from an anthropological background and he came into sociology with an anthropological background, he kind of perceived that these market economies are at work in other things too. He started, and I don't want to go too far on a tangent, but he gained this insight because he went and did some research in Algeria, in French Algeria. And in Algeria at the time, the French were trying to impose upon Algerians their market based way of thinking about the world, and it wasn't taking. And so all these academics were like, oh, these Algerians are acting in an economically irrational way. Their culture is just backwards because they can't accept Western economic rationality. And then he took a closer look and he was like, no, all of this stuff is very rational. It's like there's this gift giving kind of practice, which Marcel Mauss and other people have also looked into, where it's like, but we understand this too. If you give somebody a gift and then they go, thank you, and then you give a gift right back to you, it's offensive, right? Because then it makes it look like an economic transaction. You have to wait a period of time. But then if you don't give anything back, then you also feel slighted, right?
Right.
There's this imperative that you need to wait a period of time to return the gift so that it doesn't look like a transaction, but it is in fact a transaction. And so it's sort of like, if you didn't understand that dynamic, then you'd look at somebody, they were like somebody, you'd look at these exchanges and you would consider them economically irrational because a direct exchange wasn't made. But in fact, a direct exchange couldn't have been made because it would violate this cultural norm. You needed to have this person would need to wait a period of time before returning the favor. So it's sort of like there's all these other things at work that are not just like what we understand as like a money transaction.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's interesting. I actually just got back from Burning Man myself, which is by design a gift-giving culture. And just to riff on what you just said, yeah, you're meant to gift things to people with no expectation of anything in return. And so you shouldn't give someone a gift right after they give you one. But you also should be, you're looked at as, you should be the kind, if you're here, you should be the kind of person that is going to be giving gifts to people unconditionally. So if you're receiving gifts and you're never giving them out to other people, that transgresses that norm. And there's this sort of deep belief in people who participate in that event, for lack of a better term, that you ought to be the kind of person that gives gifts in that kind of way.
I feel like there should be like a sociological study or an anthropological study where you just send a bunch of people undercover into Burning Man who just violate the norm, who just like take and don't give back and just see what happens with the social structure of Burning Man.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothetical. I'm definitely not going to advocate anyone actually do that. Yeah. It'll ruin the vibe.
So anyway, so Bourdieu looked at the these other forms of capital, most famously cultural capital, and cultural capital is essentially the accumulated knowledge that one gains that allows them to function sort of fluidly and fluently within a given social circle. So, if you have, if you're going to be in upper middle class, college educated America, then it helps to have some sort of basic understanding of, I don't know, fine arts, or like I should say, if you do have like an extensive knowledge of, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of something that's more relevant than it would have been like 20 years ago, but like, I don't know, like in indie rock or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's going to get you somewhere, right? In a social circle of people who all graduated from 4-year universities and are living in a city. Whereas if you go into a blue collar background, it's going to get you absolutely nowhere, right? That's not the cultural capital that works within this other social circle. They have their own forms of cultural capital, which also don't translate into your elite circles. But Bourdieu saw the university as essentially a transmission vehicle of cultural capital to children of privilege, basically. I mean, there's various tiers of universities. So there were working class universities where you have different types of social cultural capital transmitted, but at the elite tier, you have people who are trained. Yes, you get some like actual job skills that help you on the job market, but most of what you're learning in a 4-year university, you're never going to use on the job. You're going to use it to in your social context, right?
And perhaps this ties into why, from that perspective, from like this sort of cultural, informational perspective, the prestigious universities in America, which I went through, they're very homogenous in that way. So like for example, like if you go to Harvard, I spent 5 years at Harvard, someone else could spend 5 years at Stanford. They're not going to be like completely distinct cultural experiences.
No,
they're actually going to be almost identical, even though like in theory, right, these are completely independent organizations. And yet like no matter what top tier university you go to, you get the same kind of general cultural vibes in each one,
Right,
basically.
right. You get a basic sort of you are they're finishing schools, right? You're taught a certain etiquette. Like finishing schools are easy to make fun of because you're like literally learning like which utensil to use, and that's like just so transparently about class, signaling. But a university education is essentially inculcates in you not only knowledge, like the actual body of knowledge that you absorb is probably the least important thing. It's much more a set of mannerisms,
Yeah.
speech, the way that you carry yourself, the like an ironic sense of humor, like
Yeah.
all these kind of like keys.
Yeah. It reminds me of, right. So there's this contrast between, I think what you're saying is like, right, there's the things I learned when I was at university, like the declarative knowledge I literally learned in chemistry class.
Right.
That's, arguably secondary to, we'll just call the cultural beliefs that you pick up. And this reminds me of Rob Henderson's phrase. I talked to him some months ago on the podcast, and he came up with this term called luxury beliefs.
Yeah.
And it ties into what we're talking
term.
about. It's like you learn how to, it's right by direct analogy with the idea of a luxury good, right? A Louis Vuitton bag is a physical signal of your social status, your economic means. The idea of a luxury belief is you learn how to carry yourself and, say things a certain way or believe certain ideas as a way to signal, yeah, I'm part of this strata of the culture.
Right. What he calls luxury beliefs is what I call moral capital, which is just a subvariant of cultural capital. Because in the past, when Bourdieu wrote, he's been dead 20 years. He wrote primarily in the last century, but, in France. But when he would write about the sort of the cultural capital of, familiarity with classical music and with the canonical poetry and stuff like that, that doesn't get you far in America. If you're if you're like start talking about Proust or something, people are just going to think you're an insufferable snob. It's not going to get you any status. Maybe in some places would still get you status, but you're much better off with a sort of a set of political and moral beliefs so there's been this kind of transition where we've stopped using this knowledge of high culture and we've started to use as a class signifier a sensitivity and a subscription to certain political beliefs and values, and like this very refined sensitivity around how you use the language. Like it's not a coincidence that you now there's actually a learning curve. Like it's not enough just like you grew up working class and then you have liberal politics because that's where your material interests are aligned. In fact, a lot of those people are shunned by sort of the most elite tiers as being, brutes, right? Because maybe they may have even considered voting for Trump because Trump was, railing against the elites, and so they're like monstrous. Whereas, if you have a command of the sort of the lexicon around, centering black bodies and like these kind of obscure, really bizarre ways of speaking, that indicates your class belonging and your upper middle class pedigree. And so there's been this sort of shift from the cultural capital that Bourdieu wrote about to now in an American context and increasingly in just a Western context to it's the exact same thing, but it's just the subvariant of what I call moral capital and what Rob calls luxury beliefs as these class signifiers.